In a bustling courthouse, the air was thick with tension. The courtroom was filled with the sound of murmurs as people waited for the trial to begin. The defendant, a teenager named Ethan, sat at the table in front of the judge, his hands nervously clasped together. He was just 17 years old, wearing a simple suit that looked a bit too big for him. His face was young, and his body slender, giving him an appearance that was far from intimidating. He seemed to be in over his head, surrounded by seasoned lawyers and a stern judge. The judge, Judge Thompson, sat at his bench with a stern expression on his face, his fingers tapping against the wood. He had been a judge for over 30 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered a case like this. As the courtroom filled with people, Judge Thompson gave a sharp glance to the defendant, clearly unimpressed by the teenager in front of him. "Mr. Ethan, are you ready to proceed?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice steady and authoritative. His tone was a mix of impatience and curiosity. It was clear he did not expect much from the young defendant. Ethan nodded quietly. He had no choice but to remain composed, even if his heart was pounding in his chest. He knew that this was his moment to prove something, to show that he was not just another teenager who got caught up in a mistake, but someone who was capable of much more. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, stood up and began his opening statement. He was an experienced lawyer, well known in the courthouse for his sharp legal skills. He looked at Ethan with a smirk, knowing that this was going to be an easy case. He had seen many teenagers like Ethan who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. Mr. Davis was confident that he would win, and the judge's dismissive attitude toward Ethan only made him feel even more certain. The trial began, and it quickly became clear that Judge Thompson was not going to take Ethan seriously. He kept interrupting him, asking questions that made it seem as though he doubted the teenager's ability to understand what was happening. Ethan, however, did not lose his composure. With every question, he answered carefully, his words precise and thoughtful. It was clear that he had been paying attention, and he wasn't about to let anyone underestimate him. At one point, when the prosecutor was going through the evidence, Ethan quietly raised his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it caught the attention of everyone in the room. "Yes, Mr. Ethan?" Judge Thompson asked, clearly annoyed. He didn't expect the teenager to have anything valuable to contribute, but his curiosity got the better of him. Ethan cleared his throat. "I believe there's a mistake with the evidence presented. If you look closely at the time stamp, you'll see that it doesn't match the location." His voice was calm, but there was a subtle confidence in it. He wasn't shouting or trying to dominate the room, he was simply making a point. Judge Thompson looked down at the papers in front of him. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. He didn't expect a teenager to catch something like that, especially when the evidence was supposed to be solid. For a brief moment, the judge's stern expression faltered. He glanced at the prosecutor, who was clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Davis, do you have an explanation for this?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice tinged with a rare hint of uncertainty. The prosecutor stammered for a moment, trying to come up with an answer. It was clear that he hadn't anticipated this. Ethan's comment had thrown him off balance. He quickly tried to recover, but the damage had already been done. Ethan's sharp observation had made the courtroom realize that maybe, just maybe, this young defendant wasn't as clueless as everyone thought. The judge, still somewhat skeptical, allowed the case to continue. But as the trial went on, Ethan's knowledge of the law began to shine through. He asked questions that no one expected, questions that revealed a deeper understanding of the legal system. He wasn't just answering questions, he was analyzing the situation, challenging assumptions, and poking holes in the arguments presented against him. At one point, Ethan stood up to address the court. The judge looked at him, still with a hint of disbelief. "Mr. Ethan, do you have something else to add?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. He was almost daring the teenager to say something foolish. Ethan, however, was unfazed. He straightened his back and spoke with clarity. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there's another aspect of the law that applies here, one that was overlooked." His voice was calm, but it had an edge of confidence that made everyone in the room stop and pay attention. As he spoke, Ethan explained the legal principle with such precision that it made the judge pause. The judge, who had spent decades in the courtroom, found himself struggling to keep up with the young defendant. The more Ethan spoke, the more it became clear that he knew exactly what he was talking about. His understanding of the law was deep, and he presented his argument in a way that even the most experienced lawyers could appreciate. The courtroom was silent. People were no longer looking at Ethan as just a teenager in over his head. They were starting to see him for what he truly was, someone with a remarkable understanding of the law. And that realization hit Judge Thompson like a bolt of lightning. Judge Thompson had mocked Ethan earlier, thinking that the teenager had no place in the courtroom. But now, as he sat there, he couldn't deny that this young defendant had something special. There was no doubt in his mind that Ethan was not just a teenager trying to make a case for himself. He was someone who had been trained, perhaps even secretly, in the ways of law. The realization began to spread through the courtroom. The other lawyers, who had initially underestimated Ethan, were now watching him closely. The prosecutor, once confident in his victory, was growing increasingly frustrated. He had no idea how to deal with this unexpected turn of events. Judge Thompson cleared his throat and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Ethan," he said slowly, his tone now more respectful. "I have to admit, you've surprised me. I didn't expect such insight from someone your age." There was no sarcasm in his voice now, only a begrudging respect. Ethan nodded slightly, but he didn't let his guard down. He knew this was just the beginning. The judge's words were an acknowledgement, but he still had a long way to go before he could win the case. And despite the momentary shift in the courtroom's attitude toward him, Ethan understood that this was still a battle he had to win. With his heart still racing, Ethan sat back down. He didn't smile or show any sign of satisfaction. This was just one step in a much larger plan. He had learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment to strike. And now, with his true abilities finally starting to surface, he was ready for whatever came next. The judge's mockery had failed to break Ethan, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this teenager was more than just a defendant. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom became even more palpable. Ethan had already surprised everyone with his unexpected understanding of the law, but this was only the beginning. He had planted the seed of doubt in the minds of everyone present, and now they were waiting for the next move. The judge, once mocking and dismissive, now watched him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, was no longer as confident as he had been when the trial began. He knew that this was not going to be an easy case anymore. The teenager sitting before him was not just any defendant, he was proving to be a formidable opponent. The defense attorney, Miss Jameson, had been quiet up until this point. She had been observing Ethan from the sidelines, watching as he carefully navigated the complexities of the case. She had always known there was something special about him, but seeing him in action was a different experience altogether. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of admiration for the young man. He wasn't just defending himself, he was dissecting the entire case, exposing its weaknesses one by one. Mr. Davis, still shaken from Ethan's earlier argument, tried to regain control of the situation. He stood up and began presenting his case once again, but his voice no longer had the same force it had earlier. The words came out more slowly, as if he was trying to gather his thoughts while also trying to anticipate Ethan's next move. It was clear that he was no longer in control of the courtroom. Ethan, however, remained calm. He was in his element now, the courtroom becoming his arena. He didn't need to raise his voice or make grand gestures. His intellect alone was enough to command attention. With every word he spoke, he backed up his arguments with logic and facts. He was like a chess player, making each move with precision, anticipating the consequences before anyone else could even see them coming. As the prosecutor continued, Ethan picked up on the smallest inconsistencies in his statements. He didn't jump to conclusions or interrupt, instead, he waited patiently, biding his time. When the prosecutor finished speaking, Ethan stood up. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, a stark contrast to the nervous teenager who had first walked into the courtroom. The eyes of everyone in the room turned to him as he took his turn to speak. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Ethan began, his voice clear and steady, "there is an important point that Mr. Davis has overlooked." He glanced briefly at the prosecutor, who was now watching him with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Ethan's calm demeanor only seemed to irritate him more. But Ethan didn't let it faze him. He continued, pointing out a flaw in the prosecutor's argument, one that had gone unnoticed by most of the courtroom. "The evidence Mr. Davis is relying on doesn't account for the timeline of events. If we consider the time the incident occurred, it's impossible for the defendant to have been at the scene when the alleged crime took place." Ethan's words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. He was challenging the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Judge Thompson, who had been watching Ethan closely, leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed as he considered the teenager's argument. This time, there was no mockery in his gaze. He was listening, truly listening, to what Ethan had to say. The other attorneys in the room exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. They had come to the courtroom expecting an easy case, but now, they were faced with a young man who had completely turned the tables. The prosecutor stammered, trying to come up with a counter-argument, but the words seemed to escape him. He was flustered, his earlier confidence all but gone. Ethan's logical approach had left him with little room to maneuver. It was like trying to fight a battle on someone else's terms. The more Ethan spoke, the more it became clear that the teenager was outwitting him at every turn. "Your Honor, if I may," Ethan said, holding up a document that had been overlooked by the prosecution. He presented it to the judge, who took it without hesitation. This document, which was presented earlier, clearly shows that the defendant was miles away from the crime scene at the time the event occurred. The time stamps on the security footage are irrefutable. Judge Thompson examined the document, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting for him to speak. The weight of the moment hung in the air, as if the whole case was on the verge of changing in an instant. Ethan stood there, unwavering, his gaze fixed on the judge. He didn't need to say anything more, the evidence was there for all to see. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Davis, do you have a response to this?" he asked, his tone now far less dismissive than before. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory just hours earlier, now seemed like a man cornered. His face turned red, and his words were jumbled as he tried to find a way to refute Ethan's claims. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. "Your Honor," he continued, "I would also like to point out that the testimonies provided by the witnesses are inconsistent with the facts we've established. One witness claims to have seen the defendant at the scene, but that statement contradicts the verified timeline. Furthermore, no physical evidence links the defendant to the crime in question." The courtroom remained still as Ethan laid out his case. Each point he made was carefully crafted, each fact supported by evidence that the prosecution had failed to address. It was as if Ethan had seen the entire case from a different perspective, one that no one else had considered. He wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the entire trial into an investigation, a puzzle that he was slowly piecing together for everyone to see. Judge Thompson, still looking at the evidence, glanced up at Ethan. "Mr. Ethan," he said slowly, his voice no longer mocking, "I have to admit, you are making a compelling argument." His tone was different now, respectful, even a little amazed. It was clear that the judge was starting to understand that Ethan was not just another teenager in over his head. He was someone with a rare talent, someone who had the ability to see the truth in a way that others couldn't. The prosecutor, now visibly frustrated, tried one last time to salvage his case. But it was clear to everyone that the tide had turned. Ethan had completely shifted the focus of the trial, and the courtroom was no longer on the prosecution's side. The judge sat back, his expression thoughtful, as he absorbed everything Ethan had presented. As Ethan took his seat again, the courtroom was filled with an electric sense of anticipation. The prosecutor was defeated, the judge was reconsidering his position, and the defense attorney, who had remained silent up until now, was nodding in approval. Everyone in the room had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a teenager not only defend himself but also outsmart everyone in the room, proving that he was more than capable of handling the complexities of a courtroom. For Ethan, this was just the beginning. He knew that he had made his mark, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth was fully revealed. As the trial continued, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, whispers of disbelief filling the air. Ethan had already managed to completely upend the expectations of everyone present. The young teenager, once assumed to be a helpless defendant, had transformed into an impressive legal mind. But what the courtroom didn't know was that Ethan's brilliance was just the surface of a much deeper story, one that had started years before this trial began. The story of how Ethan came to be in this courtroom, hiding his true identity, was not one that anyone would have guessed. Growing up, Ethan had always been different. His sharp intellect was apparent from a young age. While other children were playing games, Ethan was reading books on complex subjects like history, politics, and, most notably, law. He had a natural ability to understand and analyze complicated matters, and by the time he was 10, he could argue legal points as well as any seasoned lawyer. But despite his extraordinary abilities, Ethan was not interested in being a child prodigy on display for the world to see. He wanted to live a normal life, one where he could grow and learn at his own pace, without the pressure of being constantly watched or expected to achieve the impossible. He also had a deep personal reason for wanting to remain anonymous: his family. Ethan's family had gone through a devastating loss when he was very young. His mother, a brilliant scientist, had died in a tragic accident, and his father had struggled with the grief ever since. Ethan's father, once a proud and well-respected attorney, withdrew from the world, consumed by his sorrow. Ethan, in turn, had stepped up in ways that a child his age should never have had to. He found solace in books, in studying the law, and in keeping his true abilities hidden from the world. He didn't want anyone to know how much he understood. He didn't want to face the possibility that someone might ask him to solve problems that he wasn't ready to deal with. For years, Ethan lived under the radar, his intelligence a secret shared only with a few close family members. He quietly attended school, excelling in all subjects but never drawing attention to himself. His classmates thought of him as a quiet, introverted teen, someone who blended into the background. Little did they know, Ethan's mind was light years ahead of them. When it came time to attend law school, Ethan faced a dilemma. He could continue on the path of obscurity, hiding his talents and living a life as a normal teenager, or he could embrace his gifts and risk everything. He had seen too many examples of people who were overwhelmed by their own success, and he was determined not to follow that path. So, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Using a fake name and forged documents, Ethan enrolled in law school. He chose a smaller, less prestigious school where he could study without attracting too much attention. He kept a low profile, participating in classes but never standing out. His professors were impressed by his work, but he kept his interactions brief and avoided making waves. He knew that if he were to reveal his true abilities, he would have to face the world he had tried so hard to escape. For the next few years, Ethan honed his legal skills, learning everything he could while maintaining his secret. He became highly proficient in the law, but his talents were never publicly acknowledged. He built a life for himself as an ordinary student, someone who went about his day just like everyone else. But all the while, in the back of his mind, Ethan knew that his ultimate goal was to help people, even if it meant staying in the shadows. That is, until one day, when his life took an unexpected turn. Ethan's father, struggling with his grief, had started drinking more heavily. One night, he became involved in a legal dispute with a local business and was accused of a crime he didn't commit. Despite his legal background, Ethan's father found himself unable to defend himself, overwhelmed by his own emotions and the weight of his past. Ethan, seeing his father in this state, knew it was time to step up. Without hesitation, Ethan decided to take action. He couldn't allow his father to be dragged down by a case he didn't deserve. He used everything he had learned over the years to help him, carefully analyzing every detail of the case, gathering evidence, and preparing a defense. His father, unaware of what his son was capable of, reluctantly allowed Ethan to take the lead. In the courtroom, Ethan faced off against a powerful prosecutor who was determined to win at any cost. But Ethan's knowledge of the law was unparalleled. He saw things that no one else did, finding inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and uncovering facts that had been conveniently overlooked. As he presented his argument, it was clear that he was not just a teenager trying to get through the case. He was a seasoned attorney, calm and confident in his approach. In the end, Ethan's father was acquitted, and the case was dismissed. The experience had solidified something in Ethan's mind: he couldn't keep hiding forever. He had the ability to help people, and he had to find a way to do it without fear of being discovered. It was then that he made the decision to put his legal education to use, albeit in a way that no one would expect. Ethan knew he couldn't reveal his true identity immediately, but he saw an opportunity to make a difference. He carefully planned his next move, entering the trial where he would face the courtroom once more. This time, it was his own case, and he would use everything he had learned to fight for his own freedom. As he sat in the courtroom, watching the case unfold, Ethan felt a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. He wasn't just a teenager facing charges, he was someone who had fought for justice his entire life. Now, it was time to fight for himself. The courtroom was no longer just a place where legal battles took place, it was his battleground, and he was ready. The prosecution's arguments were strong, but Ethan was stronger. He didn't need to shout or make dramatic statements. All he had to do was use his mind, apply his knowledge, and allow the facts to speak for themselves. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now he was finally putting everything into action. As the trial progressed, those in the courtroom began to take notice. The judge, who had once dismissed him as just another teenager, now saw the depth of his intellect. The prosecutor, who had assumed this case would be a breeze, was left scrambling for answers. And the defense attorney, who had kept quiet for most of the trial, was now nodding in agreement, impressed by Ethan's brilliance. But even as Ethan proved his worth, he remained focused on his ultimate goal. He was not seeking recognition or fame, he was seeking justice, for himself and for others. He wanted to show the world that age was no barrier to greatness, and that sometimes the most brilliant minds were the ones hiding in plain sight. As the trial entered its final stages, Ethan knew that his secret was no longer safe. But in his heart, he felt no fear. He had spent years in the shadows, hiding his talents, but now, it was time to step into the light. The world would soon know who he truly was, and when that day came, Ethan would be ready to face it. As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The initial doubts about Ethan's ability were now replaced by a quiet respect. The judge, once skeptical, no longer mocked the teenager, and the prosecutor, who had been brimming with confidence, was now visibly shaken. Ethan had stunned everyone with his legal knowledge and his calm, collected demeanor. But the trial was far from over, and as it reached its critical point, the tension only grew. Ethan sat at the defense table, his expression focused. He wasn't distracted by the looks of disbelief from the gallery or the growing recognition of his abilities. All that mattered was the case at hand. Every question he asked, every piece of evidence he presented, was part of a carefully thought-out plan. He knew that this trial was more than just about proving his innocence, it was about showing the world who he really was. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, had been thrown off his game ever since Ethan first challenged the validity of his evidence. With each passing moment, Ethan had chipped away at the prosecutor's case, using logic and insight to expose the weaknesses in the arguments. Mr. Davis was now scrambling, grasping at straws, trying to find a way to turn the tide in his favor. But Ethan didn't give him a chance. Every time the prosecutor tried to raise a point, Ethan was right there, ready with a counter-argument that made it clear the prosecution's case was falling apart. The teenager's calm demeanor in the face of such pressure was almost unnerving to the other lawyers in the room. It was clear to everyone that Ethan wasn't just a teenager trying to defend himself, he was a legal mind operating on a level far beyond his years. The judge, who had been watching the trial unfold with increasing interest, now leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan. There was no mistaking it, the young defendant was something special. The case was no longer just about the charges he faced, it was about the incredible talent he had displayed in front of everyone. Judge Thompson had seen many cases in his long career, but this was something entirely different. "Mr. Ethan," the judge said, his voice steady, "I must say, I've never seen a defense like yours before. Your understanding of the law is impressive, to say the least. But I must ask, how did you learn all of this? You are not just an ordinary teenager. You have skills that even some seasoned attorneys don't possess." Ethan looked up at the judge, his expression thoughtful. He had been expecting this question. He had prepared for it, knowing that the moment would come when the truth could no longer stay hidden. But he wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. Instead, he chose to respond with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the trial. "Your Honor, I've always had an interest in the law," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I've studied it for many years, but I never intended to practice law professionally. I simply wanted to understand the world around me, to know how things work." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of sincerity. Ethan wasn't bragging, he was merely stating the truth in the most modest way he could. The judge regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't press Ethan further. Instead, he turned his attention back to the case at hand, realizing that the young man in front of him had more to offer than anyone could have imagined. Meanwhile, the prosecutor was becoming increasingly desperate. He had tried every tactic in the book, but nothing seemed to work against Ethan's logic and precision. The teenager's knowledge of the law was not just theoretical, it was practical, based on a deep understanding of how the legal system operated. Ethan wasn't just reading from a script, he was actively engaging with the case, finding solutions that no one else could see. Mr. Davis stood up once more, trying to maintain his composure. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tight, "I request a brief recess. I need time to reconsider the evidence in light of the new developments." His words were strained, and it was clear he was looking for a way out, hoping that time would allow him to regroup and find a new approach. The judge glanced at Ethan, then at the prosecutor, before nodding slowly. "Granted," he said, his tone neutral. The courtroom was adjourned for a short break, and the tension in the air remained thick. During the recess, the buzz in the courtroom grew louder. People whispered to each other, their voices filled with disbelief and awe at what they had just witnessed. Some of the other attorneys, who had been in the courtroom for years, couldn't help but stare at Ethan in admiration. They had seen many legal battles, but never had they seen someone like this, a teenager who was outthinking and outmaneuvering everyone in the room. Ethan, however, didn't get caught up in the drama. He remained focused, his mind already working through the next phase of his plan. He knew that this trial was his chance to prove not just his innocence, but his abilities. He wasn't going to let the pressure get to him. Instead, he used the break to prepare himself for whatever came next. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was pacing in the back of the courtroom, his frustration growing with each passing minute. He had been caught off guard by Ethan's brilliance, and now he was struggling to regain control of the case. He knew he couldn't let the teenager win, not after everything he had put into this trial. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Ethan wasn't just an opponent he could easily defeat. Ethan had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with. The brief recess ended, and the courtroom returned to its usual tense silence. As everyone took their seats, the judge looked down at Ethan once more, his gaze lingering longer than before. It was clear that the trial had shifted in Ethan's favor, and the outcome was uncertain. But what was undeniable was that Ethan had not only proven his own innocence but had earned the respect of everyone in the room. Mr. Davis was the first to speak when the court resumed. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tinged with frustration but also with a hint of respect, "I have no further evidence to present. It is clear that the defense has raised reasonable doubts about the prosecution's case." Judge Thompson nodded slowly. "In light of the evidence presented, I am inclined to agree. The defense has made a compelling argument." He looked down at the papers in front of him, then up at the gallery of spectators. "The court will deliberate on this matter." As the judge prepared to make his final decision, Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table. He had done everything he could. Now, all that was left was for the judge to weigh the evidence and determine the outcome. The courtroom was silent, each person holding their breath, waiting for the judge's verdict. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. This was his moment, and he was ready for whatever came next. Judge Thompson finally looked up, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "I will deliberate on this case and announce my decision shortly," he said, his voice firm. "But one thing is clear, Mr. Ethan, you have proven yourself far beyond your years. No matter what happens here, you have earned the respect of this court." Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the judge's. He had done what he set out to do. The trial was not over, but his victory was already in motion. The courtroom was filled with a quiet, tense air as everyone waited for Judge Thompson to return with his decision. Ethan sat at the defense table, his back straight, his hands resting in front of him, betraying no sign of nervousness. Despite everything that had happened in the past few hours, he remained calm. He had already proven something far more important than his innocence. He had proven that he was capable of greatness, a legal mind well beyond his years. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but all Ethan could hear was the steady beat of his heart. He was aware that, regardless of the verdict, his life was about to change forever. People had seen him, and they would remember him. His secret was no longer safe, and that terrified him, but at the same time, it filled him with an overwhelming sense of relief. He had done what he set out to do, show the world who he was, and now, there was no going back. After what seemed like an eternity, the doors to the courtroom opened, and Judge Thompson entered. The room fell silent as everyone stood, waiting for the judge to take his seat. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. This was at the moment when everything would be decided. Judge Thompson sat down at his bench, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing the importance of the next words he was about to speak. He looked down at the papers in front of him, then up at Ethan. For the first time during the trial, there was no trace of sarcasm or doubt in the judge's eyes. His gaze was steady and filled with respect. "Mr. Ethan," Judge Thompson began, his voice calm but firm. "After careful consideration of the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides, it is clear to me that you have proven your case. The prosecution has failed to meet its burden, and the doubts you raised about their evidence are not only reasonable but compelling. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't allow himself to show it. He kept his expression neutral, his mind already processing what was happening. He had known that this moment would come, but it didn't make it any less real. Therefore, Judge Thompson continued, "The charges against you are hereby dismissed." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "This court acknowledges your exceptional understanding of the law, and it is not lost on me that you, a young man, have managed to dismantle the case against you with clarity and precision that most attorneys would envy." A murmur of surprise spread through the courtroom. The audience was clearly taken aback by the judge's praise, and even the prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory, stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. Ethan sat there, the weight of the judge's words settling over him like a cloak. He had done it. He had won. But the victory wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about something much bigger, proving to himself that he wasn't just a boy hiding behind a mask of normalcy. He was someone capable of changing lives, someone who could stand up for what was right, no matter the odds. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, finally broke his silence, his voice strained. "Your Honor, I respect the court's decision, but I must say that I find this outcome unusual. I had no idea that a teenager could possess such legal expertise." Judge Thompson nodded slowly. "Mr. Davis, your doubt is understandable. But I believe we have all witnessed something extraordinary here today. Mr. Ethan is not just a defendant, he is a legal prodigy. Whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, the truth remains." Ethan could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now. There was no longer any mistaking who he was. The teenage boy who had once been dismissed as naive and inexperienced was now someone who commanded respect. His secret was out, but strangely, he felt no fear. Instead, a sense of pride washed over him. He had proven himself, not just to the judge, or to the prosecutor, but to everyone who had ever doubted him. As the judge concluded the trial, he gave Ethan a final look. "I hope you will use your talents for good, Mr. Ethan. The world could use more minds like yours. But remember, with great ability comes great responsibility." Ethan nodded, the gravity of the judge's words not lost on him. He had always known that he had the ability to do something great, but now, that responsibility felt real. The world wasn't ready for someone like him, and yet, there was no turning back. He had already made his mark, and there would be no going back to a life of hiding in the shadows. But for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't scare him. It excited him. As the court was adjourned, Ethan stood up, his heart still racing but his confidence soaring. He walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. People in the audience stared at him as he passed, their expressions a mixture of awe and admiration. He had done what many thought was impossible. He had proven that age didn't matter when it came to knowledge and intelligence. And he had done it all without boasting, without showing off. He had simply relied on what he knew, and that had been enough. Outside the courthouse, Ethan was met by his family. His father, who had been sitting quietly through the trial, stood up and walked over to him. His eyes were filled with pride, and for the first time in years, there was a lightness to his step. Ethan had not only saved him from the legal troubles that had threatened to destroy him, but he had also given him a new sense of hope. "Son," his father said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say. You've done something extraordinary. I've never been prouder of you." Ethan smiled, but he didn't say anything. There was no need for words. His actions had already spoken for him. He knew that this moment would mark the beginning of something new. The world had just seen a glimpse of his potential, and there was so much more he had yet to offer. As they walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Ethan felt the weight of the future pressing down on him, but he also felt a sense of excitement. He had always known that he was meant for something more, and now, he was ready to embrace it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he was ready for whatever challenge came his way. He had proven himself in a courtroom, but now it was time to take on the world. And this time, there was no hiding who he was.